Welcome back into Iggy Sports Talk. I'm your host, Jiggy Nazuski, or Iggy for short. I want to thank you so much for tuning into this episode. This is your first time watching or listening to Iggy Sports Talk. In each and every single episode, I shed light on the mental aspects of sports and life. And today, I'm going to be speaking about the Super Bowl, which is one of the biggest events of all of the year. But I feel like most people look at the media coverage, the X's and O's, and don't really think about the mental side of the game and the pressure that comes with not only playing in the Super Bowl, but just in the NFL playoffs in general. And I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Carrie Hastings, who's a licensed clinical and sports psychologist and is the current team psychologist for the Los Angeles Rams and Angel City football team. Dr. Hastings is a former Division I athlete herself and is a graduate of University of Notre Dame, where she captained the track team as a hurdler and sprinter. And she has a passion for normalizing help-seeking behavior among athletes and promoting a total wellness. But she also was a part of the Super Bowl team in 2018 with the Rams, where they lost to the Patriots, and also won a Super Bowl with the Rams in 2021. So she did a great job of not only shedding light on those mental aspects that come with playing in the Super Bowl, but also how she helps the athletes, not only for the Los Angeles Rams, but also for the Angel City football team, to really find their identity outside of the game of football and not allow the pressure of some of these big games to dictate how they play on the field, as well as how they validate and value themselves. But without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Dr. Hastings. How are we doing today, Carrie?
Doing fantastic, Jake. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you taking the time. And especially as we're getting closer to the Super Bowl. And, over the last month or so, the NFL playoffs have been going on. And I feel like so many times we hear the media only talking about the X's and O's or just the scores and the statistics. But I think a lot of people forget about the mental side that goes into these different games, especially with the pressure. I'm curious, just to start off, how different is it for the mental preparation for the players from a regular season game to the playoffs or a Super Bowl game?
Well, and that's a great question. It's not much different in terms of the internal preparation and individual preparation in terms of playing and pregame routine. What's different is the stage. And so it's helping players prepare for bigger, louder crowds. If they are not in their home stadium, whatever that stadium is known for in terms of just logistics, in terms of weather, and so just helping them anticipate potential curveballs, because you can't block out those higher stakes. So it's
Mhm.
just knowing how to kind of incorporate them and then manage them.
That makes sense. And, you were a part of the Super Bowl winning team, in 21, as well as, the Super Bowl team in 2018, where they fell to the New England Patriots. And I'm curious, especially with your first season being in 2018 with the organization, from obviously the tough loss, I'm curious from a mental side or a sports psychology side, how you sort of tried to, I guess, in the best way possible, spin that into a positive, or you could even make it in general, just a general loss. Like, how do you try to spin that into a positive rather than, sticking with the negative?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to have a losing season and, when we don't meet our own expectations. But it's also part of sport. And it's almost helpful that it is a team sport because it's always a collective outcome. And so it's acknowledging what happened and figuring out how to learn and grow from that. And so there were very concrete things that the team knew we could work on. And there were also a lot of injuries, and, all you can do from that is heal, and you can't
Right.
fast forward that process. So it's also just kind of looking reality in the face and knowing that you will have a fresh start at some point and being patient for that. Um, but it's, emotionally, you kind of have to feel that disappointment first.
Mhm.
And then that eventually manifests into motivation.
That makes sense. And how does some of those games, like, when you meet with different players, maybe, like, especially if a player is looked at as one to have, like, I guess not help the loss, but there is times where the media points out a player or points out a play and blames it on that player or situations like that. And I'm curious, like from the next week after that game, what sort of process do you try to go with some of those players if they didn't play well, or if the loss hurt a little bit more than others, to try and not get in their own head and beat up themselves?
Well, at this level, all of the athletes are perfectionists. So it's very common for them to be self-critical and, focus on maybe that one bad play when all the other plays could have been fantastic. So, it's kind of just helping to rationalize irrational thoughts and dispute maybe the negative and overgeneralizing. So they think they had a terrible game, but really it was maybe a rough first quarter. You can't let that categorize your entire outing that day. And maybe you did have a bad game, but does that define you as an athlete? Does that mean you can't have an awesome game the next time? So kind of just putting it into perspective and helping athletes reframe how they view their performance, not letting social media be the voice of the critics of their performance. It's funny because it's almost impossible not to look at it, even though that seems like it would be an easy solution. But the ones that have a hard time will focus maybe on a negative comment when there are 100 positive comments. So it's also just helping to stick to your true self and what you're capable of, and then go back to basics.
And if a player does come to you and are kind of in their head about some of those comments, or if one of the talk shows said something, I'm curious how you try and help them reframe that and not allow it to impact just their regular life, but also their play as well.
Yeah. Well, sometimes, when the media doesn't know all of the facts or all of the details, they will fill in the blanks themselves, which is almost fun to review with a player, because we can laugh at, what they think is going on, when that's not necessarily the case. And that's easier then to not let that get to you. And, if it's accurate, if the player maybe didn't do so hot, then they almost would expect nothing less. At this point, they've been exposed to enough opinions and judgments on themselves that it doesn't take them by surprise. But again, it's just kind of going back to business, and why are you here? What are you here to accomplish? And going back to that person's individual goals and then the collective goals of the team.
And, especially with, after a bad game, you mentioned like trying not to allow it to, put themselves down, or you try to help them reframe it afterwards. And I feel like in athletes that I've talked to in the past, they always mention that it's tough to not allow their play on the field impact them at home, and to leave work on the field and, have home be home. And I'm curious, especially with some of these bigger games too, where, it's the season just stops out of nowhere and you don't expect it. Like, what are those conversations like after the season to try and help them not bring that frustration home and use it as motivation, I guess, for the next season?
The abruptness of the end of a season is one of the hardest things. It's hard for me, because, each year the team is different. And so it can, especially when you're favored to win and you expect to win. And then all of a sudden, boom, the next day you're turning in your equipment. So I think that it's allowing space to kind of mourn the losses, but limiting that. I think that while a positive mindset is always helpful, I think a realistic mindset is more of a buy-in sometimes for athletes, because it's not always sunshine and rainbows, and there isn't always a silver lining. There is always something to learn from. And that's kind of where I go back to, okay, it didn't go your way this time. What can we take away from this? Because there's always something that you can take with you, whether it's, into the next game, into the off season, into retirement. And so it's interesting because some players do a good job of not taking the emotions of a game or of a season home. Others, it's really hard to separate. And either way, it's just different personalities. But to a point, people ask me that too about my job. Like, how do I not take things home with me? I think it's unrealistic to think that you wouldn't take anything home with you. I think you almost wouldn't be as invested as you should be in what you do. Having said that, you also have to be able to disconnect and recharge and reset. And so finding that balance based on that individual is the key, and what works for them in terms of like, what do you need right now? Do you need space, or do you need to be around your family and not think about football for a little while? And then figuring out ways that they can gain that mental rest, even if it's active.
And I completely agree with what you said. It's not always sunshine and roses, and there are even times where like I'm struggling, and one of my favorite sayings is everything happens for a reason, or everything's happening for me, not to me. But there's times where that's tough to believe in different moments, or maybe that doesn't even help. Like you said, maybe some space, maybe some family time is the best for that. And I think too, with different situations that happen throughout a season. You brought up injuries. It's been interesting to see sort of how the Rams were able to overcome injuries during the 2022 season, and how they were able to use it as motivation for this past season. But from your experience during the 2022 season, where it was after the year where they won the Super Bowl, and obviously Matthew Stafford went down, Cooper Kupp dealt with some injuries. With those types of injuries, obviously it's not always easy to look at it in a positive light, but how do you try and do that the best way, and really help them work on their mental while they're also trying to like heal their physical as well?
Yeah, injuries. I would say coping with injury is a close second in terms of what I see the most, only to anxiety. And there's often an overlap there, depending on the severity of the injury, how long somebody's going to be out, and, where we are in the season. It will impact the player, in various ways. And the biggest tool that I think I use with that is staying in the present, because really it's easy to dwell on what happened and what you're missing, and maybe what you could have done differently to avoid that injury. And then, you can be thinking about the future of like, all right, if I'm back here, then, I can start running again on this date, and they kind of work backwards. The problem is with athletes at this level is that, the training staff tells them they have 6 weeks recovery. Well, they hear 4 because they are so competitive that they want to win at rehab, and they want to, be the best in terms of healing and heal the fastest, when really it's just unrealistic.
Right.
You don't have that much control over your body. You can definitely maybe speed it up a little bit with some imagery work, and like you said, working on the mental game while you're out. That's a big tool, and really can do a lot of good. You can get those mental reps in, and feel like you're doing something when your body can't do much.
Right.
And then combining that with film, and then anticipating, the return to play, and how can I use this? How can I sharpen this in my mind? I think a lot of people, there's a misconception with imagery. People think it's just visualization, but the key to imagery is actually feeling what you're visualizing. So feeling it in your body, feeling everything in your surroundings with all of your senses. And that's what gets it very vivid and as close to the real thing as possible. And that's really what has the biggest effect on players who are out. But time can move so slowly during that healing period, that, it's really important to celebrate the small wins. And, we reflect on the progress at the end of a week, or because from day to day, sometimes, players can feel like there's not much difference and they're not making any progress. So focusing on what they can do, if they can stand on a knee when the week before they couldn't put any weight on it, hey, that's progress.
Right. And I bet, especially when there are some of those setbacks, like, I mean, that must, put them into a little bit of like a mental spin of, why is this happening to me? You know what I mean? Like, what could I have done differently? But I think, imagery, I hadn't actually thought about that especially with injuries, but that's something that I think is super powerful, whether you are injured or whether you're playing as well. And, especially, at the beginning of the season, every single NFL team's goal is to, get to the Super Bowl and hoist up that trophy. And I'm curious if with any players, or if any players have expressed that they've done this to you, of visualizing or using imagery to motivate them to get to that pinnacle of hoisting up the trophy. Because for myself, I use it for my own type of goals, but I think, like you mentioned, there is imagining or visualizing you holding up that trophy, but what's that feeling like? Like how do you, what's that gratification feel like? Do you see, the confetti coming down? What does it feel like? Just different stuff like that. So I'm curious if any players have brought that up to you.
Yeah, I think that players definitely, want to be hoisting that trophy. I think it's more in the idea of being a world champion, the idea of kind of reaching the pinnacle, more in a general sense, which is a great long-term goal. But what we do then is we back up and break that down into as small mini goals as possible, and achievable goals maybe for that practice, for that week. Not just physical goals but mental goals as well. And that's still part of that journey to the quest for a Super Bowl win. I will let you in on a little tidbit from our last Super Bowl. So Von Miller was on our team at the time. He had been traded over, and when he was with the Patriots, he had, before one of their Super Bowls, or sorry, not the Patriots, with the Broncos, had put the Lombardi during a team meeting, like before the Super Bowl, as like motivation, like a visual motivation, the actual trophy. So before our Super Bowl a couple years ago, we had a team meeting, and he came in and put the Lombardi down on the table, and it just, like, everybody went wild. It was like, there it is, this palpable, tangible symbol of what everybody wants and why we're here. And so that, I think, was a great example of kind of what you're talking about, and reminding everybody, like, here we are, week, 18, and it's such a long season. And especially for rookies who are used to a much shorter collegiate season. But then it's like, you see that, and it's so remindful of, like, okay, this is why, and it gives a new energy.
That makes sense. I bet it also, like, I bet Sean McVay loved that, because, like, it gives more motivation for guys to put in that extra work. Why not question, why are we doing this extra rep? Because of that. That's the reason. And I saw a video of Aaron Donald doing like a hype up speech or a pep talk to himself before the Super Bowl. And I think it's very interesting to see sort of the pregame routines that guys not only have just in a regular season game, but especially in those bigger games. And, we've even seen, college players like JJ McCarthy, meditating before the game. And I'm curious how much of your work goes into helping those guys define those routines. I bet obviously throughout high school, college, and just, in the beginning of their career, like they have stuff that's helped them. But is there any suggestions that you give, kind of like the positive affirmations, to help them get into that positive mind state?
Yeah, that's a big part of what I do. There is a lot of continuity when they come in from what's worked for them in the past. Kind of like we were talking about before, it's helping with the transition to this much bigger stage, and the transition even to this being a job, and just the circumstances being different in that sense. Some players have never left their state before, coming out here. So with all of that, helping them incorporate these new factors into maybe a pre-existing routine, developing relationships with coaches. So sometimes I'm working on players with how to best communicate with a coach, and vice versa. So it's kind of adjusting to the unique circumstances, not only of the NFL, but of each week and each, opponent. I often make a point to remind people not to forget their identity, not just as a football player, but really looking at themselves. And sometimes players were really looking at themselves in this way for the first time, because all they've ever talked about is football. All they've ever thought about, all they're ever asked about is football. And so I will often, at the beginning of the season with the rookies, I always do one of my favorite activities called Identity Pie, where I have them draw a circle that's the pie and basically ask them rapid fire questions about themselves. And they don't have much time to answer, but they just have to jot down something. And the pie has like a bottom crust and a top crust. And so the questions for the bottom crust are about maybe family, friends, faith. And it would just be like one word answers or short phrase answer, but those are the foundation of who you are. So that's the bottom crust. And then the top crust questions are more about how you present yourself in the world. How do you think people perceive you? What impressions do you want to give? Kind of those external factors. And then the real important ingredients are in the middle of the pie. And that's, I ask them about things about themselves that they may have never thought about. And that can be things as basic as, what's your favorite place to travel? What's your favorite color? Who's your favorite band? Just all things that would contribute to their identity. What would you be doing if you weren't playing football? That's always a good one. And it just gets them to think about themselves as a whole. And that contributes to their why. And that's the other thing we spend a good amount of time on is, what is your why? And are you still playing for it? Now that it is a business, now that you might be supporting family members back home, has your why changed? I've had players maybe who are struggling with that, or who feel like they might be losing the love of the game. Just go out to the field, and I'll tell them, just when nobody's around, just go out, just sit on the field and just be, and just look around and try to reconnect with what caused you to fall in love with the game to begin with. And that can be really helpful in just bringing someone back to who they are and why they play, and what motivates them and what should be motivating them.
Yeah, that's such an important subject. Almost every single, whether it's a football player or baseball player, any athlete that I've talked to, that is the number one thing that they've struggled with. And that's the number one advice that they give to younger athletes. And I think it's amazing that you do that, especially with the rookies, because with the identity piece, they've been told that they're the best in their town or the best in their college or whatever throughout their life. And then once it's all gone, you know, who am I after that? What value do I bring? And you know, so much of that is tied to their ego as well. And you know, I think especially with the piece as well of finding that love again in the game, you know, being able, and that definitely changes the play. It definitely changes the motivation that they have to put in the work each and every single day to be the best of themselves. And I think especially with that identity piece, when guys are starting to get to that place where they maybe want to retire, how do you maybe ramp up that talk a little bit more so then they feel as prepared as possible when they do ultimately retire?
Yeah, that's always an interesting series of conversations. And some guys are kind of on the fence sometimes, and it's dependent on how that season ends up and how their body's doing. So we just kind of explore all of the potential outcomes and um, where their heart is versus their head.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, some guys at that point have families. Um, some guys are young, but their bodies just aren't doing what they need them to do, maybe due to past injury, and and they can't keep up with it anymore. So it's also just preparing for that, because even if they are completely ready, it's still going to feel like a loss. And so preparing them for that, and just the complete change of lifestyle that, you know, it will be once they are done with the league. And what will they do with that time? That's a big thing too, because that's where a lot of athletes who have really only connected with that identity as a player can struggle, because they're left with, who am I? What do I do now? What am I even good at? And so, you know, those are kind of some of the questions we look at and explore in terms of immediate future.
That makes sense. And, you know, you brought up reflection a little bit earlier, and I'm curious, especially when there was that Super Bowl win in 2021. One thing that I found really cool was Matthew Stafford's reaction. You just saw him go down to his knees and get really choked up. Even the moment got me choked up. And then you see Sean McVay walk over and, you know, they're obviously hugging and stuff. But how do you, after something big of win as that, for guys who have never won before, try and help them reflect on how much they've grown throughout that season, or how proud they should be of themselves? Because you know, I feel like that always isn't remembered. Like there's the accolades that come with it, there's the excitement and feeling and life achievement that comes with it, but I'm curious how reflection plays a factor in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for somebody like Matthew, who was coming from Detroit and his story there and the adversity that he faced, to come here and just have that happen, it's just such an incredible story with a, I don't want to say happy ending because it's not quite done yet, but I think it's easier to reflect and really appreciate with someone who had a longer history. For some of the new guys, I will see a little bit of ego and arrogance come in with them at the start of the next season, or expecting to just get there again. But if I learned anything from being at two Super Bowls, it's it is so hard to make it to the Super Bowl. It's so incredibly hard. And even if you win, and even if you have most of the same players back, it is a totally new season. There really shouldn't be any favorites, and anything can happen, and the unexpected always happens. And so it really is an accomplishment that that's one something I try to drive home, is how unusual it is. It really is potentially a once in a lifetime experience. And, you know, each year the team is going to be a bit different, you know, especially after a Super Bowl, when a lot of other teams want our coaches, you know, there's a lot of movement. And so you come back and it's, you really are starting fresh. So again, putting things in perspective, not letting guys kind of sit back on their haunches and making them work just as hard as they would, um, whether or not we won a Super Bowl. So I think that those are some of the big things, and then also being mindful that that's not all that matters in life.
Right. And I think that's important as well. It ties back into the identity aspect, the ego too. And I'm curious from your viewpoint, looking at those two Super Bowls, what differences did you see with just the energy of the team, not looking at talent whatsoever, but like I'm curious just what differences you noticed and maybe what ultimately helped them get to that finish line rather than, what happened your first Super Bowl.
I'm really glad you asked that because I have a very clear answer to that. And there was a very visible and palpable difference between those two Super Bowls. The first one, as we went along, it was just so exciting. There was so much energy. And when we made it to the Super Bowl, I remember that, those weeks and just like going into our break room, and it was like a party. People were just on such a high that we made it to the Super Bowl. And then a few years afterwards, when we went again, it was a totally different vibe. When we got to that point, not much changed. There wasn't as big of a difference in the building. It was almost like people were afraid to treat it any differently. And in that sense, everybody just kind of kept their heads down, kept grinding, knew we had a job to do, and knew we weren't finished. Because there was almost a sense the first time that like we won the Super Bowl. And I think that was a good wake-up call for the next time when it was like, hey, we've got a job to do that we are very capable of getting done. So let's do this. And it was all business.
I think you see that a lot even this past year with the Ravens dancing in the locker room and the Andy Reid and the Chiefs just being like, all right, let's go to the next game. I think that does ultimately play a factor in the mindset of the guys going into those different big games. But the last thing that I have for you is, Sean McVay has been the head coach since you've been with the organization. And, I saw a video of him and Cooper Kupp on the sideline this past year, and Cooper was upset about a play that he made. And it was really cool to see sort of Sean positively help him get out of his own head. And I'm curious from your experience, with him as a head coach over, the last few years that you've been with the organization, how have you seen him evolve as a coach and start to implement some of I guess, the mental side of coaching throughout the years?
Sean's a great guy. I think he is such a unique and incredible coach. He really prioritizes connecting with the players. He genuinely loves his players, and that shines through in his coaching style, through adversity. I think he's really settled into the position over the years. He's very familiar with what the role itself feels like. He's been through, the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. And I think his perspective has even changed over the years to where, in the beginning it was all about, getting to a Super Bowl. And I think adversity maybe would rattle not even just him, but everybody, because we were still new to LA. And now he just approaches things with a greater confidence and is more unflappable and really has allowed himself to embrace the whole person when it comes to being there for his players. He wants to know if players are struggling, what he can do, how he can help them, even if it's totally unrelated to football. And if it's appropriate and if, the player gives me permission, then I will fill him in on some stuff. And, if a player, there's been instances where I remember there was a time when we had a player who had a a sick relative, a sick immediate family member who was very, very ill. And during the week was just off. I mean, was not playing well. And it got to the point where the coaches were talking about cutting him. And they had no idea this was going on. And so finally I ended up sharing this with the player and saying, hey, if you're okay with it, I think we should let the coaches in on this so that they know you're not just playing badly. You got a lot of stuff going on. And he was okay with that. And so that's what we did. And I remember Sean, being so grateful to have heard that, gee, we just thought he wasn't playing up to standard anymore. And but that can be a real game changer. And so I'm so grateful to have him as our head coach and to have such a collaborative relationship with him, and that he does truly care about people, not just players, not just the game. But he does want to be involved as much as he can, and just a great guy.
That's amazing to hear. And, I think a lot of people forget about those factors, whether they are, on the team side or as well as, in the media too. So I think it's always very important to, look at all those different factors with anything in life. So I really appreciate you taking the time today, Carrie, and for sharing your insight, and as well as, being able to shed some light on some of the mental aspects of the Super Bowl, and also just like being a sports psychologist in the NFL. And I think all the amazing things that you are doing, not only with the Rams, but with your stuff on the side, with sports psych, I think it really helps people like myself as well as just other sports fans learn more about those mental sides of sports and just life in general. So if you want to check out more of what Dr. Carrie is doing, you can check her out over on Instagram at Sports Psych by Dr. H, and LinkedIn under the same exact handle, Sports Psych by Dr. H. Did I miss anything? Is there anything else that you want to promote, or any other way that people can check out the amazing things that you're doing?
I think those are the big ones. I a couple of years ago opened a sports psych facility in our local community, just because I think that finally, sports psych is being incorporated at the professional and even collegiate level when it never used to be. But there's such a need at the younger levels and, the high school level, even youth sports, to where I think a lot of bad habits can be addressed earlier on. Athletes can learn a lot of tools and coping skills earlier on so that they don't become, a negative later on or a struggle later on. So I think any ways that people can help athletes at that level, and provide them with resources, would be great. And if anyone needs ideas, the website for that facility is sportpsychologywlv.com.
Perfect. I'll put that all in the description, but thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I hope that you did enjoy my conversation with Dr. Hastings and got a little bit more insight on those mental aspects of playing in the Super Bowl. And you were able to now look at this game in a different light. That's honestly my goal of each and every single episode, is to really help you change your perspective on how you view sports, as well as how you view these different athletes. Because I think a lot of times people forget these guys are human beings as well. They look bigger than humans, on TV, in the media, the amount that they get paid. But at the end of the day, they're just like you and I, where they have to clock into a job and go home and deal with their normal life, pay the bills, So I feel like it's really interesting to hear Dr. Hastings' insights on how these players really prepare for these big games, like in the NFL playoffs or in the Super Bowl, as well as her thoughts on how they deal with injuries too, because that's a big part of not only just sports, but especially football, with how physical it is. And you hear all the time with multiple injuries, how it can really impact a guy's mental as well as, his physical, and how he goes about his daily life. So I hope that you did enjoy this. And if you want to hear more episodes just like this one, where I focus on the mental aspects of sports, I have tons of other great episodes over on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. I had the opportunity to speak with Marcelo Meyer, who's the top prospect for the Red Sox, Alek Manoah, also JJ Redick, Mel Kiper Jr., many other people. So make sure to check out those episodes over there. You can also follow Iggy Sports Talk over on Instagram. I'll post clips not only from the podcast, but also just guys talking about mental health in sports from different publications. And I'll also be updating you guys on everything that's happening regarding the podcast. So make sure to follow the account over there. And I hope that you enjoy the Super Bowl and your team who you're rooting for wins. I'm going to be rooting for the 49ers. I think it would be amazing to see Brock Purdy, the Mr. Irrelevant, lead them to a Super Bowl. But I think it would also be cool to see Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce win back-to-back and ultimately continue their amazing dynasty that they have going on right now. But I greatly appreciate everybody tuning in. I'll see you and talk to you next time. Peace.